Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to find your seats, we'll get started. Delighted to see everybody here tonight. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the museum. For those of you who may never have been here, this is Cantini, and it's the historic estate of Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime publisher and owner of the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Tribune Company, who passed away in 1955 and left Cantini as a public park for the people of Illinois. And if you've come down from Wisconsin or over from Indiana, you're just as welcome as the people of Illinois. We're delighted to have you here. Second in the Colonel's heart, only to the Chicago Tribune, was the 1st Division of the in World War I, and he was devoted to the 1st Division and his comrades and veterans and soldiers for the rest of his life. And so it's very fitting that there is a museum on this property to the 1st Division. The way we conceive of our mission here in the 1st Division Museum is to tell the story of America's military history in the 20th century through a very compelling story of the 1st Infantry Division. Founded in 1917, or activated in 1917, and on continuous active duty ever since. There has not been a day since June 26, 1917, that the American people have not been served by the men, and now the men and women, of the Big Red One. And they are currently in Afghanistan. The division headquarters is Regional Command East headquarters, and the 4th Brigade is over there, and the 1st Sustainment Brigade, and so on and so forth. And we use that story to tell the story of America at arms and America at war to 150,000 people like you who visit us every year. And it is vital that we do so because this is a democracy, and we the people are responsible and accountable for the common defense, and therefore we need to know something about the common defense. And it's in that vein that we have this wonderful light here that is so hot that it is burning the folder that I just slid up there under the light. But we're not on fire, and do not run for the exits. We're fine. I just put it out, okay? But at any rate, it's in that vein that we bring a variety of speakers, and none more distinguished than our speaker tonight. Tom Ricks is a fellow at the Center for a New American Security, which is an independent think tank dedicated to helping develop pragmatic and nonpartisan national security policies. He's a contributing editor of Foreign Policy magazine. He writes the blog, The Best Defense, named the best blog of the year by the American Society of Magazine Editors in 2010. He has covered the United States military for the Washington Post from 2000 through 2008. Until the end of 1999, he had the same beat at the Wall Street Journal, where he was a reporter for 17 years. He has been a member of 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning teams for national reporting, in both cases on American military affairs. He has covered U.S. military activities on scene, on site, embedded with the troops in Somalia, Haiti, Korea, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Kuwait, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He is the author of several books, including The Gamble and the #1 New York Times bestseller, Fiasco, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And he's going to talk to us tonight about his book, The Generals, and all of these books are available in the lobby afterwards, and Tom has very graciously consented to spend some time after his talk here to personalize those for those of you who would want them. And he's going to tell you how badly we've been served by our generals since World War II. And some of those generals are people I know very well and have served with and admire and respect. And you might want to know, well, why in the world would I bring Tom Ricks out here to talk bad about these guys? I'm not so sure. The answer to that is, except that this is what democracies do. They let bright people who are not in uniform criticize their military, and that makes all of us stronger. And Tom does a terrific job of it with a great heart for the United States. So it's my indeed my pleasure to welcome to the podium Tom Ricks.
Thank you very much. Just want to begin by asking, can you all hear me in the cheap seats? Okay, don't need to, okay. I want to begin by asking a question. I think we have several veterans of our wars here. I'd like to ask first if we have any veterans of Iraq or Afghanistan. Would you raise your hands? There's one, okay. And of our other wars, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and 1991. Wow, okay. Thank you very much. It's an honor, and it'll keep me on my toes. I spoke in San Francisco about 10 days ago on the chosen reservoir campaign of the Korean War, sitting in the front row with his arms folded like this, pretty much like you, was a colonel who had served at Chosin Reservoir. And every time he nodded, I sort of sighed with relief. I thought I'd talk for about 20 minutes and then get into your questions and answers, which I find in many ways the more illuminating part of this sort of activity. I want to talk about Army generalship from World War II to now. I just noticed, I've never seen my nose 2 feet big. It's a little bit scary. When Paul Herbert graciously invited me to come speak tonight, it focused my mind on something I hadn't really noticed about my book, which is that the 1st Infantry Division runs through it like a thread. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and indeed Iraq, where I was embedded with the 1st ID in the spring of 2004 outside Najaf. I think it was the Iron Dukes Brigade, if I recall. The Dukes of Diyala, they call themselves. Could I get a glass of water? I'm getting a little bit itchy. Thanks. Oh, here we are. Yep, thanks. Yep. Indeed, the beginning of this book, the moment of origin, I can trace exactly to a time and place, and it also involves the 1st Infantry Division. I was on a staff ride of Sicily a few years ago, 2005. I'd come out of Iraq deeply puzzled by what was going on there. And as a kind of busman's holiday, I was studying the Sicily campaign, July, August 43, when the Americans and the British and Canadians took Sicily from the Italians and Germans. And a graduate student was talking in the staff ride about the culminating battle of the campaign at Troina High in central Sicily. In the staff ride, you look over what was the information available to the commander. Sometimes you actually look at documents from the campaign. You walk the terrain and try to understand what they were thinking and doing, how they did it, what were the difficulties, what worked, what didn't. And it really struck me that in this discussion, one of the graduate students from Johns Hopkins mentioned, rather casually I thought, that at the end of the Sicily campaign, Terry de la Mesa Allen, commander of the Big Red One of our most successful combat commanders in the 1st year of the war in Africa and Europe, was fired. This is a good combat commander, a terrific combat commander, a favorite of George Marshall, yet Omar Bradley canned him. And my jaw dropped. I thought, wait a second, I'm just coming out of Iraq, where nobody gets fired for nothing, where mediocrity is more than a word, it's a core value. How do we get from World War II, where successful commanders are being relieved, to the same army, essentially the same materials, going into Iraq, and as one lieutenant colonel famously said, a private who loses his rifle is punished more than a general who loses part of the war. What happened to accountability? And I began pulling on that thread and pulling on that thread, and it actually pulled me into military archives for several years, about 3.5 years. I immersed myself in the works of George Marshall. Marshall became a real hero to me, not just World War II, but even going back to World War I. Marshall is involved with what they called the division then, because it was the only division. It later becomes the 1st Division. And actually comes to prominence in an interesting way. General Pershing is there reviewing the division's training exercises and really doesn't like what he sees and begins chewing out the division commander and everybody else present. George Marshall, I believe a captain at that point, interrupts and says, wait a minute, you need to know something. Pershing turns away. Captain Marshall reaches out and grabs the general by the arm. This is not a recommended career move. And says, you need to hear me out. And he does. This is a key aspect of George Marshall that I think people have forgotten today, and this is something we all should remember. He speaks truth to power. Not only does he speak truth to power, it is the means by which he advances. Not always steadily. Douglas MacArthur exiled him to Chicago, but he made his way back into the Army. George Marshall was a great man. He was a good man. He was not a nice man. He could not afford to be. He was an honest man. As a brigadier general, he was in the Oval Office in a meeting with President Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, who could really be a manipulative BS artist, says at the end of a meeting, isn't that right, George? Marshall has two responses. First of all, he's going to make it clear to the president that his name is General Marshall. It ain't George. That misrepresents the relationship. Second, he says, no, I don't, sir. FDR is kind of taken aback. But FDR is enough of a BS artist to know that he needs somebody to throw the flag on him. And on September 1, 1939, George Marshall formally becomes Army Chief of Staff. And he continues to speak truth to power, and Roosevelt knows that's why this man is so essential to him. At one point in 1940, May 1940, he stands over President Roosevelt and rather angrily says, unless you do something right now, I don't know what's going to happen to this country or this world. We need to get on the stick militarily. And Roosevelt listens to him. Henry Morgenthau, then the Secretary of the Treasury, later credits Marshall's statement that day to turning around Roosevelt on military policy. George Marshall, as one of his first steps, before he even became Chief of Staff, planned a revamping of the Army. He and a smart young colonel named Matthew Ridgeway discussed for about 10 days how to change the Army. They were going down to South America to kind of stave off Nazi inroads. And they sat on the deck of the cruiser, the USS Nashville, and talked for 10 days, Ridgeway and Marshall. How do we get the Army in shape? Marshall's first plan, the one he implemented, was to clear out 600 officers at the top of the Army he considered deadwood. That was the term he used, deadwood. And then he instituted a Darwinian system of general officer management. In World War II, 155 men served as commanders of divisions, Army divisions in combat. Of the 155 Army division commanders in combat, 16 were relieved for combat ineffectiveness generally. The slows, fatigue not being on the ball. Of those 16, however, 5 were given other divisions in combat later in the war. So a very dynamic but somewhat forgiving system. The bottom line was that in World War II, there was extreme accountability enforced by General Marshall and understood by subordinates. As Omar Bradley said, if you don't relieve your incompetent subordinates, I will relieve you. This creates a system in which success is rewarded, failure is punished, and promising young officers are promoted. Trivia question. So far, nobody's got this. Who is Major General James Chaney? C-H-A-N-E-Y. Nobody's got it yet. I'm actually speaking at Leavenworth tomorrow. I'm hoping somebody will know there. Major General James Chaney was Eisenhower's predecessor as the American commander in England. Marshall fired him replaced him with Eisenhower, and Cheney ended the war commanding a boot camp in Wichita Falls. Because of the Marshall system, people don't know names like Cheney. Most people don't remember names like Lloyd Fredendall, another fired commander. But they do know names, especially in an audience like this, like Jim Gavin, Matthew Ridgeway, Dwight D. Eisenhower. These were the young men brought up, or the younger men brought up. Eisenhower, I really came to like and admire in the course of my research. I read everything I could find that Eisenhower had actually written. And by the way, these guys in World War II could write. Reading Ridgway's papers, Marshall's papers, Eisenhower, they write with a clarity and vigor. As an old English teacher, I really like, these are guys who obeyed E.B. White's rules of writing. They have verbs pushing around nouns. Boom, boom, boom. They know what they're thinking. And if you don't know if you can't write it, then you're probably not thinking it clearly. They were good writers. Eisenhower's just tone also impressed me. I just love reading his accounts of things. And it really struck me what a world they were being thrown into. On December 12th, 1941, Ike is sitting in his office at Fort Sam Houston, gets a phone call. Ike, get up here. Get up to Washington. His heart sinks. Oh my God, I sat out World War I and now they're pulling me into a staff job. I'm not going to get in combat World War II. He'd been asking, he'd been hoping that Patton, when he got a division, would give him a regiment. But orders are orders. The weather's lousy on December 12th, 1941 in Texas, so he can't get a flight. He's already missed the Blue Bonnet Express heading eastward. So he gets an Army monoplane to fly him about 30 feet above the tracks eastward until they catch up with the Blue Bonnet Express, and they signal the engineer. They stop the train. Ike hops out of the plane, gets on the train. There are no seats left. So he's sitting there on a suitcase in the aisle. A Texas lawyer walks up and says, "Colonel Eisenhower, what are you doing sitting on the suitcase?" He says, "It's actually Brigadier General Eisenhower, just promoted." He said, "Well, General Eisenhower, my boss, Mr. Murchison, who's a big Texas oil man, he has his own car at the back of the train. Come back and sit with us." So Ike goes back, plays poker and drinks liquor, to whiskey for 2 days on the train ride up to Washington. He arrives in Washington on the morning of Sunday, December 14th, 7 days after Pearl Harbor. His brother Milton picks him up at Union Station and drives him over to George Marshall's office, which stands right, by the way, where the Vietnam Memorial now stands, because the Pentagon was not yet completed. He walks in on this Sunday morning. Marshall looks up, doesn't really know Eisenhower. He's met him a couple of times. Looks up and says, "Eisenhower, tell me how to fight the war in the Pacific." That's interesting, okay. Eisenhower says, "How long do I have?" He says, "This afternoon." Eisenhower sits down and begins typing, types a 3-page memo. He says, "You got to abandon the Philippines, hold on to Australia as your base, and maintain the sea lines of communication out to Australia, and that's how you're going to begin fighting your war. Do not fritter away your troops trying to defend the Philippines. Do not fritter away your troops trying to defend the West Coast, as many politicians are calling on you to do right now, to garrison a lot of troops out there." This is not strategically a big shock. This had been a discussion for years with the Navy, War Plan Orange, Plan Dog, and so on. I think what Marshall was doing was testing Eisenhower. He didn't know him well. He knew that I could work for MacArthur for several years in the Philippines. Was this guy a MacArthur guy? And B, did this guy have the ice in his veins to abandon thousands of old friends and colleagues and comrades in the Philippines? And the answer was yes. Ike was willing to put that on paper. A big test was passed right there. And Ike had a lot of ice in his veins. Not long after that, he puts 12,000 troops aboard the Queen Mary, conscious that there are lifeboats for only 5,000. And he hopes it outruns the German submarines across the Atlantic. He has a bit of a tense moment when word comes through that an Italian spy has reported the Queen Mary leaving port. But it gets through. He takes his risk and wins it. By the way, Murchison, the guy aboard the train, 12 years later, was the central funder for Eisenhower's presidential campaign, leading a group of moderate Republican Texas oil men in support of Eisenhower against a group of far-right Texas oil men, the Hunts, H.L. Hunt and so on, who were supporting Ike's old boss, Douglas MacArthur. My gut feeling is that Ike ultimately decided to run for president to prevent MacArthur from becoming president. Not only did he loathe him personally, he also distrusted his politics. My favorite Eisenhower line about MacArthur is one day a woman said to him, "General Eisenhower, do you enjoy the theater?" And he said, "No, but I did study drama under MacArthur." Fast forward, Korean War. Korean War is going badly. The first 6 months are a mess. Matthew Ridgeway is sent in there at the very end of 1950, and in a short period of time turns the war around. Now, even more than Eisenhower, Ridgeway is a Marshall protege. In fact, I believe Marshall was notified that he was going to become Army Chief of Staff. He was staying at Ridgeway's house. Ridgeway was then a major at the Presidio in San Francisco. Ridgeway goes into Korea and informs the Army pretty quickly, I'm going to get rid of 5 of the 6 division commanders out here. And this causes heart flutters at the Pentagon. Wade Hayslip, then the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, writes back to him, and I've read the documents of the Army archives and quote it in the book. Wade Hayslip writes back to him and says, look, if you start firing these guys and make a big, it'll make headlines, it'll be embarrassing, Congress will start asking embarrassing questions. So they tell him, you can do it, but you've got to keep it on the down low. Disguise it. Find some place to park some guys. We'll tell people it's a normal rotation. In fact, Joe Collins is already up on Capitol Hill lying about it. So Ridgeway's allowed to, but that really is the death toll for the Marshall system of relief. It turns out in small, messy, unpopular wars, it's harder to relieve people than in a big existential war like World War II, where everybody was very serious about the prosecution of the war. In Vietnam, the tradition of relief is all but lost. And this takes us back to the first ID. William Depew is commanding the first ID in Vietnam, and he's a World War II-style general officer. The counts vary of the number of officers he relieved. I've read everywhere from 35 to 55 in a one-year tour. Finally, Harold K. Johnson, Army Chief of Staff, shows up in his hooch Christmas time and says, you can't do this. Johnson has said to others, Depew is eating up officers like they were peanuts. And Depew says, no, I've got to get rid of these guys. They're not competent. And his assistant division commander leans forward and says, Johnson says to him, you're not supposed to get rid of these guys. You're supposed to train them. And Hollingsworth, the assistant division commander, says, that's funny. We thought you were supposed to train them. We were supposed to fight them. Not a good thing to say to the Army Chief of Staff. Interestingly, though, Depew walks out of the meeting thinking he's going to be relieved. But the tradition of relief has been lost. Harold K. Johnson, though he vigorously disagrees with the way Depew was running the first ID, does not relieve him. In fact, as best as I can tell, only one division commander was relieved in Vietnam, and unfortunately it was not Samuel Koster, commander of the Americal Division, who in the Army investigation was found to have likely been guilty of a felonious destruction of documents and cover-up of the My Lai murders. No, Koster was allowed to stay in the Army. After bringing more disgrace on the Army, I think, than any officer since Benedict Arnold. Now, the general officer relieved in Vietnam as a division commander was Major General James Baldwin, and I think it's 71 or 72, I'm losing the date right now. Creighton Abrams wants to demote him too, and the Secretary of the Army says no, and it doesn't happen. But James Baldwin's moment in history is that, as far as I can tell, he was the last division commander relieved for combat ineffectiveness in the U.S. Army. So to today, Army generals are not fired for incompetence. They are fired for moral lapses, for indiscretions that embarrass the institution. Being an Army general today is a lot like being a university professor. You have tenure. You can't be fired for doing a lousy job as long as you keep your pants on. Basically, personal indiscretions are firing offenses. Professional mediocrity is acceptable. It's a lake woebegone army where all the generals are above average. And it's not true. When you don't relieve incompetence, you have an incompetent institution by definition. An institution that tolerates incompetence becomes incompetent because it can't properly recognize success or punish failure. And rather than incentivizing success, you incentivize risk-adverse mediocrity, cautious, keep your head down behavior. And if you have a rotation system, you reinforce all those tendencies. Everybody just wants to keep their head down, keep their nose clean, and get out without causing any fuss, because it's someone else's war 12 months from right now. Nobody's in it for the duration. In World War II, everybody knew that the road home went through Berlin. When you have a rotation of senior commanders, you can basically say, I was successful, the guy after me must have screwed it up. And so you get this kind of, what my friend Andrew Exum, who fought in Vietnam and Iraq, Exum calls it casual arrogance in our approach. 11 commanders in 11 years in Afghanistan. You couldn't run a corporation that way, it would go bust. This is a big reason we have wars that are stalemated, wars in which we know how to win the first battle, but not how to bring the war to conclusion. Whenever I hear a general officer tell me he's a war fighter, I think to myself, no, you're not, you're a battle fighter. Guys like Tommy Franks were trained to win the first battle, partly because of the great reformation of the Army led by William Depew in the 1970s. But it was so focused on getting together a good tactical army that I think they lost hold, and Paul Herbert literally wrote the dissertation on this. They lost hold on larger strategic thinking. They lost hold on generalship. And so the Army loses its concept of generalship. Clausewitz tells us that the first and foremost task of a general is to understand the nature of the conflict in which he is engaged. Tommy Franks fails that most basic of tests. Basically, the Army confuses battalion command with generalship, and you get a bunch of jumped-up battalion commanders, Tommy Franks, Ricardo Sanchez, who really don't know what a general is supposed to do. Tommy Franks actually writes in his memoirs that he outsourced his thinking to what he calls the 50-pound brains, the smart colonels, when the first duty of a general is to think. What is the fight I'm engaging in? What is the nature of this conflict? What are the important things? What are the essential things? What do I do about them? How do I devise a response? And then how do I implement the response through orders to thousands of soldiers? Franks believes when you take the enemy's capital, you have won. Turned out the enemy didn't get the memo. And in both Afghanistan and Iraq, the real war begins after we take the enemy's capital, because they know, don't take on Uncle Sam conventionally. He'll clean your clock. Lie low, wait, study him, find his vulnerabilities, look for his seams. And one of our seams was officers who didn't know how to understand what they were looking at. Another seam was rotation. I remember an Iraqi general, an ally of ours, telling me how to work with an American general. He says, first you meet with him, and he comes in and says, Ahmed, Muhammad, whatever your name is, there's a new sheriff in town, I'm him, and this is what you're going to do. And he says, you nod politely and have some tea. Second month or so, the guy gets your name right, and he comes in, and you start sort of slow rolling him. About 4 months in, you agree to certain changes. You start implementing them slowly. You miss a few meetings. You have to go on the Hajj. And, basically then you're at 7 months. He said, then he gets really angry with you and says, this is going to be the way, and you kind of go along with him a little bit. And then around month 11, he's totally focused on rotating out. And then you get ready for the new guy who marches in and says, Ahmed, Muhammad, whatever your name is, I'm not like that other guy. You're not going to do me. And this was from an ally telling me how to work with the Americans. Can you imagine what the insurgents are thinking? They didn't rotate. And when Charlie doesn't rotate, when the insurgent doesn't rotate, you have a problem because he's learning on you constantly. What we need is adaptive generals. You get adaptive officers through encouraging critical thinking, through not just training officers, but educating them. People tell me you can't have a counterinsurgency army also capable of conventional warfare. I respond, if you have adaptive officers, you can. My Exhibit A would be H.R. McMaster. As an Army captain, leads the most conventional of battles, a tank charge against Iraqi armor at the Battle of 73 Easting in the 1991 war. Fast forward to Iraq, Colonel McMaster, commanding the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, is one of the first officers to figure out an effective counterinsurgency strategy. Same guy. What makes him adaptive? Well, I would say he's a thoughtful officer and a good leader of men and women who considers the situation and then acts on what he sees. He's not just a guy who's going to do what he's been trained to do because it's the only thing he knows how to do. He doesn't do what he knows how to do, he does what he needs to do. And I would point to his background. H.R. McMaster also did a PhD in military history at the University of North Carolina. It became a terrific book on Vietnam called Dereliction of Duty. That's an adaptive officer. We want to encourage that sort of critical thinking, that ability to understand these things. So, where are we now? We're in a situation where some generals do get fired, but it's only the top guy, when the civilians become frustrated or unhappy with the course of a war. Harkins and Westmoreland relieved in Vietnam, Casey in Iraq, McKiernan and McChrystal in Afghanistan. Firing the top guy is no way to run a war if it's the only option a civilian leader has. It's like firing the manager of the baseball team every time you fall behind in the score. Sometimes you want to do it, more often you want to put it in a relief pitcher. So in conclusion, everybody says these days we want to support the troops. My response is, you want to support the troops? Give them good leaders. Look, Afghanistan is a small, unhappy, messy war. But a soldier blowing up in Helmand Province today is every bit as dead as a soldier machine gunned on Omaha Beach. And he is every bit as deserving of good leadership. And I think it's a responsibility of citizens, to go back to what Paul Herbert was saying, to ask tough questions that get us better leadership. If you want to support the troops, encourage Congress to push generals. Don't accept every answer that comes down the pike. Soldiers deserve good leaders. And that's my pitch. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got a couple microphones on the back, and we'll take questions for a little while. The first one is right up here. Please wait until you have the microphone before posing your questions so everybody can hear.
Of all the different generals, you know, and backgrounds, Ned, do you think Patton was the best one?
I'm a Patton fan. Did you all hear the question? Okay. I'm a Patton fan, but I will defer to Eisenhower's judgment. Remember, Patton is one of Eisenhower's closest friends. They make bathtub gin together in the 1920s at Fort Meade. That said, Eisenhower is extremely narrow in his praise for Patton. He does not call him a great combat leader. He does not call him great even just on the offense, because everybody knew Patton was not good on the defense. He repeatedly calls him good at the pursuit, a rather narrow mission. Yeah, one that the Army knew that they would eventually have in World War II. They would be chasing the Germans across Northern Europe. And Patton was kept on tap for that. But I'm struck at how narrow Eisenhower's praise for one of his oldest friends is.
a little bit less about generals. You mentioned the concept of rotation of the generals. And I just want to go back for your opinion. In Vietnam, with the rotation of the enlisted ranks being the first, I don't know what happened in Korea, I'm not familiar with that, but especially with draftees going for 1 year, is that a reason the war lasted so long? You're not there for the duration? Is that a part of the reason?
I think it is part of it. I actually worked hard to puzzle out the history of rotation. I was surprised I couldn't find one, a history of rotation. Because remember, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, people who really understand the Army talk personnel policy. And I was surprised I could not find a history of the rotation policy. As best as I can determine, it was introduced late in Korea, partly out of a sense of fairness. They were really worried about the demoralization of the troops in Korea, especially after MacArthur's comment that we were going to that soldiers referred to as the die for a tie. When MacArthur basically said the way Ridgeway is running the war, we're just going to have a stalemate. Thanks, Mac. Rotation in Vietnam is even more problematic. Yes, the enlisted soldiers had a 1-year rotation. Officers had 6-month combat tours flip-flop with 6-month staff tours. I still have a hard time getting my mind around that. We know, statistically speaking, that soldiers serving under a green commander, and I would say any commander with less than 6 months in combat is green, have a much worse chance of dying than do soldiers serving under a seasoned commander. William Depew, to go back to the big red one, commented that we ran the Vietnam War to serve the interest of the officer corps. And it was an insane way to do it. Because remember, not everybody actually got 6 months in command. A lot of guys are wounded, a lot of guys aren't really good, and they kind of get shuffled off. So you get some companies, rifle companies, that in 1 year get 3 commanders. I found one that had 7 commanders in 1 year. Also, because Lyndon Johnson refused to activate the reserves in July 1965, they ripped through the NCO Corps, the sergeants, really quickly. And basically, by about 68, every NCO has done a combat tour. And a lot have done too. And if they're going back, they're not going to be in the front, they're going to be in the rear. So we wind up with a green force. I remember coming across one infantry company that of 150 or so men had 2 soldiers in the whole company, including officers and the NCOs, 2 soldiers who had been in the Army more than 2 years. So we basically broke the Army in about 3 years by refusing to activate reserves. And we made it even more complex and difficult with this swift rotation of commanders. And as I said, Charlie's not rotating. And so the other guy is studying you. One thing that's really striking in some of the information that's coming out of the Vietnam War now is I think we were tactically much less effective than we thought we were. Even in our specialty, in Depew's specialty, and Westmoreland's specialty, the delivery of firepower. I think an awful lot of firepower was delivered onto empty spots in the jungle. Because one thing enemy fighters learned pretty quickly was don't stay in the same place for 15 minutes after you've engaged American forces. It's also striking that in the Vietnam War, we entirely lose the ability to pursue a fleeing enemy. Almost, and this is David Richard Palmer writes in this in Summons of the Trumpet, there are almost no cases of enemy forces being tracked down and decisively defeated in the Vietnam War. We basically engaged the enemy, encountered the enemy, usually on his initiative. Then we pulled back and called in firepower, either from air or artillery. And it looks like a lot of the time when we thought we were hitting them, we weren't.
Thanks very much for your talk. But my question is, there's been a lot of talk lately about the notion of rock star generals. And my question is, how has that perception changed over the years, and what does it mean for the troops on the ground?
I've been surprised by this whole sort of wave about generalship that's followed the Petraeus scandal. Newsflash number 1, Dave Petraeus is a human being. Newsflash number 2, Marine officer flirts with woman. I mean, these should not be big surprises. It just underscores to me how out of touch Americans are with the military. We basically have a 1% military that fights our wars, 99% that don't pay attention. We've also asked a whole lot of these people. David Petraeus has more combat tours than any American general in World War II. These guys have been fighting a lot for the last 10 years. And not only David Petraeus gave at the office, his wife has sacrificed a lot. And the response of the nation was not the grateful response of appreciative nation. I think we are ingrates. That when these people had a bad spell in their marriage, we dragged them through the mud gleefully and mocked their lifestyles. Sermon over. That said, yeah, being a general, a combat commander, these days is kind of amazing. I said in the Washington Post that it was a little bit like being a combination of Bill Gates and Jay-Z with a lot of lethal firepower added. You know, and I've been in the bubble with these guys. You know, you fly in on a 727 out of Tampa into Turkey overnight, and then the next morning into some base in Iraq, and before the plane even rolls to a stop and the engines are still turning, the cars pull up at the base of the plane and you're off to a meeting in an air-conditioned office, and in one day you're in Baghdad, Mosul, Kirkuk, and then you fly down to Kuwait, you meet some senators, you come back in the next day. It's an extraordinary, heady lifestyle. And I do think one thing that happened to Petraeus was not only had he been under enormous strain for a long time, when he left the Army after 40 years in uniform, I think he was almost disoriented, alone, and I think he was disoriented in the sense that this is not the David Petraeus I knew 15 years ago when he was a colonel. I was really surprised by this, that Petraeus would have this problem. Bottom line for me, though, is we should care more about the public duties of our generals than their private lives. We should care more about what they do in the field, in the office, than what they do in their bedrooms, especially when, as far as I can tell, nothing illegal happened with Petraeus. It was consenting behavior between adults. Why the FBI thinks it has to investigate lovers' quarrels is beyond me. As for the soldiers, what do soldiers care about? Yeah, they like integrity, honor, and everything else. You know what they really want in a war? They want to survive it. They want combat effective leaders. And they will put up with racist leadership, alcoholic leadership, and pure son-of-a-bitch leadership, as you mentioned George Patton. They liked these guys because they gave them a little faith that they might survive the war, and if they didn't, that their lives weren't thrown away by some blowhard moron. That's what they want. And they deserve it. It's not too much for a soldier to ask, give me good leadership that I have some faith in. And all the rest of it, the morality, not really a problem. Terry Allen, one of my favorite commanders, in World War II was noted to have become so drunk on occasion that he could not stagger to his Jeep, he would crawl to it. Matthew Ridgeway, another one of my heroes, got himself a new wife for every war and rubbed it in the Army's face. He'd put his wife's name on the nose of his airplane, and it was not the same name it was last time. When you go through Ridgeway's papers in the Army archives up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, there are all these good cables back and forth between him and Collins and Mark Clark and Wade Hazlett on combat leadership, how to improve it. Interspersed with these are some very terse notes from Ridgeway's first wife's divorce lawyer.
Getting back to the idea of asking more from our generals and asking more from our armed forces leadership, what can we do, what can politicians and elected officials do to demand more? I mean, and I guess over time, what broke down from a World War II where all these folks were being fired and maybe we had an FDR who was willing to stand up to Marshall and at the same time recognize his smarts, to over time we have, say, a W. Bush and a Cheney who are deferential to Franks and to a Ricardo, and not willing?
I would say rather the opposite. I would say excessive deference on the part of military leaders to civilian leaders. Rumsfeld just runs right over Tommy Franks. You know, it's like the Road Runner cartoon, just beep, beep. Tommy Franks doesn't know what hit him. The job, though, of a four-star general is to speak truth to power, as George Marshall did. To say, sir, with respect, and to lay out your differences. And then, when you get the order, okay, got it. Marshall's rule was, whenever you disagree with an order, you must implement it with 110% of your energy. Even more vigor if you disagree with it, just so to make sure you're doing it right. That's your duty. It's a problem because, yes, Congress should push these guys. Congress will not push these guys until there's a political reason to do so, which means voters are unhappy with them. Voters are not unhappy with them. Voters are happy to ignore the war, and politicians understand this. Why? Because the American people do not have skin in the game. I have never seen somebody change faster than my sister when her son rebelled, graduated from Berkeley, and joined the Marine Corps. She went from, anti-military to, like, at one point she starts referring to civilians as them. You are not in the Marine Corps. But she has, one bumper sticker, the old one says, wouldn't it be great if the Pentagon had to hold a bake sale? And the other one is, my son is a Marine. She got skin in the game, and her attitude changed. Until American people, and especially American elites, have skin in the game, Congress is not going to pay attention. It's a lot of work in Congress. There's nobody who's sort of naturally inclined to do it. You don't have that old generation of guys who had been muddy boots sergeants in Vietnam, Korea, or World War II, sitting on the armed services committees, who are not deferential to generals, whose attitude is, wait a damn second, General. I have stood in the blazing sun of Fort Benning listening to some blowhard general. I'm not going to sit here and listen to you, X, Y, Z. Instead, you get kind of the Newt Gingrich mindless cheerleading for the military, or the liberal left attitude, which is, I don't know anything about the military, don't want to know, don't bother us, and it's kind of like the kid with the schoolyard bully. Here's my lunch money now, don't beat me up. Neither attitude is good for the military. What the military needs is solid civilian oversight. Now, I've seen some defense secretaries provide it. I would say Dick Cheney, as defense secretary, did. I would say William Perry did. And I would say that Bob Gates did. They provided adult leadership at the Pentagon, and the military was quite grateful for it. You have an additional problem here, which is that civilian politicians of both parties were scared by Colin Powell, a politically powerful, independent officer who had a sort of independent political base. And so since Powell, I think we've seen purposefully chosen weak men, or at least inarticulate men uncomfortable in Washington, pliable men often, to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Richard Myers and Peter Pace being two of the leading examples. These are not guys who rose by speaking truth to power, who do not have that habit, and I think lack the moral gravity to say to the president, have you thought about this? What about this? I'll do what you tell me, but you need to tell me you have considered this. Have you considered the strategic consequences of taking Saddam Hussein off the map? Will it become then a proxy of Iraq? These are the type of questions that civilians need to hear from military leaders and frequently don't. In addition, with President Obama, I think you have a problem is that he doesn't want to be a war president expressly. He wants to be a domestic president. He's elected on a domestic agenda. And his nightmare is Lyndon Baines Johnson. He's talked about how he studied the Vietnam War and how Johnson's domestic agenda, which he really likes, was undermined by the Vietnam War. And so I think when Obama sees a general walk into the Oval Office, he kind of sees a William Westmoreland mask there. You're going to screw up my presidency, aren't you? And he doesn't want it. So it's a very difficult problem for military leaders. How do you talk to a president about the military when he doesn't want to talk about the military? But I go back to the basic problem, which is the American people. If the American people care, Congress will care, the president will care.
Your comments were very well received. Enjoyed them. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is basically twofold, or one is a comment and one is a question. Do you think the media today has done much to hinder the generals and the generals' form of generalship, as well as, you know, their social ineptness in some cases does not necessarily detract from their proficiency as soldiers? That's point number one. The second one is your comments about weak chairmans. Personally, I believe that the last strong chairman we had was John W. Vesey. And having had the opportunity and pleasure of working for him over a number of years, I just think that after him, there wasn't any.
A good comment. Always nice to hear a shout out for General Vesey, a muddy boots soldier. First point in the media, yeah, well, actually 3 points in the media. First point is I have been so grateful in the last 3 weeks that I am not working in a newsroom anymore. I would have hated to cover the Petraeus thing. I would have looked at the mirror with self-loathing. And I was wondering today, and I don't know what the answer is because it's hypothetical, would I have quit rather than hound this general? I don't know. I would like to think I would, but you never know. The media environment has changed. The information environment has changed. I don't think I could get away with carrying on with Kay Summersby the way he did in World War II today, because somebody would have snapped a cell phone photo of them holding hands or something on their long horse rides in Algeria, which seemed to last a long time. I don't think, though, that Ike would have been relieved over it. I think we fought World War II too seriously. I can't imagine Marshall saying, now Marshall did chew out Ike for his intimate relationship with Kay Summersby, his beautiful British chauffeur. But I don't think Marshall would have said, you know, Ike, we know the D-Day is coming up, but you just lack the moral standing to lead that invasion, and so we're leaving you, and you know, we're putting in some other guy. And sure, thousands of guys are going to die on the beach because they don't have an experienced commander, but that's the way it's got to be. The American people are demanding it. The American people would have said, you know, I don't care what he's doing in his private life. We need the best possible leaders out there we can get. If you have skin in the game, it kind of focuses your mind. The media is a problem also just because it's part of the public. Congress, public, and the media. There's very little understanding of military effectiveness. What is a combat leader like? What does a good combat leader do? And unfortunately, everybody thinks they're an expert on sex. There's an old saying in the newsroom that the two worst subjects to cover are sex scandals and sports because your editors think they're experts on both. But what editors don't know, what reporters don't know today is military affairs. It strikes me that no generation of new reporters came out of the Iraq War. And in fact, Rick Atkinson, me, have gone off to become full-time book writers. My friend Anthony Shadid continued to cover wars but got killed, as a lot of photographers did. And so I don't see a lot of savviness in the media on the military, and that's worrisome. But it's part of the general national inattention. Again, if the people really wanted it, they'd get it, but people don't want it.
Thank you. Earlier you pointed out when you were talking about FDR and that time that everyone knew the road went through Berlin. It seems to me that's been missing ever since. Going back to the Vietnam thing, I believe General Krulak spoke very pointedly to LBJ, and then LBJ thanked him and ushered him out of the room, and he retired. There's a message there, and there has been no road to victory since World War II. So would you comment how the generals are and the other officers and squad leaders and sergeants are supposed to react to that? And also, I think the ice water in their veins goes from squad leader and any other rank that knows their men are going to die when they send them forward, not just generals.
It is true that in these small, messy wars, it's much harder to know what success looks like. And I think in many ways it's more difficult to be a general. It's not how many miles is it to Berlin, how many tanks did we kill yesterday. That said, you can see in Ridgeway in Korea and Petraeus in Iraq, clear success where predecessors were not successful by operating in different ways. So I think it is possible to have success. There has been, I think, a decline in the quality and especially the moral bearing of our four-star officers. I'm struck that during the Vietnam War, the Joint Chiefs finally got their courage together and went in to see LBJ in the Oval Office and told him, Mr. President, we don't like the way you're running this war. We really think you need to do X, Y, and Z, basically take the war much more to Hanoi in much more direct ways without gradual escalation. LBJ turned his back on them for a full minute, and then he turned around and swore at them in the most vulgar possible abusive language, which I will not quote. The CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, got in his car afterwards and turned to his Marine aide and said, I've never been spoken like that in my life. Yet none of these men resigned. Had a president spoken to George Marshall like that, I am confident Marshall would have said, Mr. President, I clearly have lost your confidence, and you need to find another person to hold this position because you and I are finished here. Yet they lacked the moral standing, the moral bearing to do that, the understanding that your duty is sometimes to speak truth to power and always to try to do the right thing. Instead, you get these guys who kind of put up with Donald Rumsfeld's abuses and his dithering, by the way. Rumsfeld had this very decisive image, but was a real ditherer inside the Pentagon. Bob Gates, by contrast, just a natural-born killer. You know, a smile on his face, and he slices off guys' heads so fast they don't even know they've been decapitated. You know, sometimes you want that in a Secretary of Defense. But one reason you get those officers is because that's what the president wants. So you need a president who's going to say, you know, I want some people who are going to give me advice sometimes, even when it's uncomfortable. And the message I think the top guys are getting right now is they're not comfortable. They're not going to get that. Partly also because you have such an intensely political national security establishment. It's the only time I can remember that the President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense all come out of Congress, and the National Security Advisor and the Deputy are former congressional aides. That's a very narrow background to bring to the ballgame. It's a very political lens through which to look at national security affairs. I would like to see much more diversity in point of view. Backgrounds in corporate America, academia, government experience, as Bob Gates had, consummate bureaucrat. And you don't see that. You see this congressional background. And then they're going to replace Leon Panetta with John Kerry. I mean, you know, yeah, exactly. I start thinking either I'm going to pray or move to Canada, you know.
Thanks, JD. Interesting talk tonight. One thing that comes to mind for me, this may be slightly outside your scope, is the way Lincoln handled his generals during the Civil War, and it seems to be a cyclical thing. Could you comment on that compared to today's atmosphere?
I began the book with Marshall, partly because Marshall presides over the rise of the American superpower. He takes the Army from, I think, about 180,000, 85,000 in 1938, 39, including the Army Air Force, to 8.25 million 6 years later. But that's why I focused on him. But you do have this tradition going way back. In the Revolutionary War, there are a lot of senior level reliefs. Lincoln goes through generals until he finds Grant. Pershing in World War I fires people left and right. And one thing Marshall is determined to do is not to allow incompetent officers to go overseas in World War II because he saw the burden it placed on on Pershing, and instead stop these guys before they get overseas. And that's what he tried to do for his overseas commanders, is I'll keep them here in the States. But the problem is when you're writing a book, you know, I get people saying, but you left out so-and-so, you left out this. But, you know, the book is a pretty big book. It's 2 pounds. You got to stop somewhere, or write a multi-volume tome that nobody's going to read.
I'll take one more question, the gentleman in the back.
If I heard correctly, you spoke briefly about what I could call a crisis in education. Now, what I'm seeing is a lack of cultural and historic awareness among young men going AWOL. And when I talk to their officers, I wonder, my concept of warriorship is a well-rounded individual. Do you think the erosion of education in general is affecting our warrior leaders? Do they have knowledge of Plutarch, Osprey? Do they have this background that empowers them to be effective leaders?
I would kind of disagree with the premise in that our frontline force is extremely good these days. Small units, especially small combat units, well-trained, well-equipped, cohesive units. Now, their combat readiness is declining. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, now this is called the 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment or something, just went through a training rotation in October in Germany that I hear through channels was a small disaster. I mean, basically, they did not know how to operate in the field anymore. We have a generation of soldiers who know how to operate off of FOBs, off of bases, or even out of outposts, but do not know how to operate in a conventional offensive in the field. But I am not worried about the quality of the tactical fighting. These guys are extremely good. This is a combat seasoned force. A lot of people are getting out, but the military is also shrinking. Where I want education in generals is the basic concept is training is for the known, education is for the unknown. Training is for tasks that you can see. Education is to help you understand chaotic environments where the solution is not clear. We have a lot of generals who are trained but not educated. So they are prepared to do a lot of basic tasks, but they are not prepared to deal with problems that their toolbox doesn't address. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to sign books out back.
Okay, thanks much. I'll be very, very quick, but first of all, as I tell our speakers, we're a cheap date, but we have for you this entirely environmentally correct stainless steel drinking bottle, and it's got the 1st Division Museum logo on it and the big red one, and you can keep it separate from everybody else's drinking bottle because yours is the big red one. And I think, yes, and Carol will take you there. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, that's next week. We're going to beat up on more generals. Bob Sorley is coming here to tell us all about General Westmoreland, and I hope you'll come. Normally we're the first Wednesday of every month. This was an exception because Tom was in town, and I greatly appreciate his coming here. I hope you come back next week. Next slide. If you don't know about the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans in Wheaton, you should. And if you want to help a great institution that is doing a great task here in the local area for vets who maybe have not had as much good fortune in their lives as myself and some of the members of the Legion Post, drop by the table with a red, white, and blue mailbox, drop a little spare change in there. We'll collect that money up and make it sure that it goes to that entirely private, nonprofit institution that is doing tremendous good for deserving people in our community. So I'd appreciate you doing that. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you next week. Fill out your evaluations, please.